So thank you everybody so much for joining us. In the top, what is it that my top right-hand corner is Angela Prusa. Below her is Adam Laviskachny and Verona de Prier is below me. If each of you could please just give a short description of what you do for the listeners to be able to understand what your standpoints will be during the debate. Angela, starting with you.
I'll start. So my name's Angela Prusa. I am a cannabinoid practitioner. That means I work with the cannabis plant as medicine. And I am also a NADA acupuncture practitioner for trauma and addiction. And I am the founder of the Cannabis and Hemp Association of Namibia and a local cannabis advocate.
Thank you very much, Angela. Adam?
Yeah, hi. I'm a social worker in private practice with a specialization in addiction treatment and care on an outpatient basis at this point with Irongo Social Services.
And Adam, just for the record, you're not taking a stance either pro or anti-cannabis in this debate. You more want to discuss the addiction sort of side of it.
Correct, yes. And although I would like to acknowledge the merit of both sides, actually, yes, okay. There is some merit in both sides. Yeah.
All right. And Verona?
Hey, I'm Verona de Prier. I'm also a social worker by profession. I've actually worked 25 years in the Ministry of Health and Social Services, focusing on prevention, treatment, legislation, a lot in substance abuse, addiction, tobacco inclusive. And then now I'm in private practice, and my company's name is UniHealth.
Thank you very much. All right. Is everybody ready to start? I've got my stopwatch here. Answers 2 minutes, please. Angela, is it in order if we start with you and we just keep the same order running?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay. Perfect. So question 1, is addiction of any drug, including legal drugs like cigarettes and alcohol, an individual issue, read personality type, or a societal issue? Is it trauma related?
Okay, so I want to just point out here the very important fact that we do not just get addicted to substances, but also to behaviors and acts. So screen addiction, gambling, sex, pornography, gaming, food, shopping, all of those activities trigger the same response in our brain as substances. For me, severe addiction of any kind is a response to trauma. Hundreds of thousands of people use alcohol and recreational drugs, sugar, sex, and food in a balanced way without getting addicted. And although some substances for sure have addictive properties on the body, and some more so than others, and some of them are harder to wean off and potentially dangerous, for example, like alcohol, sleeping pills, opioids. But the essence of it is the fact that addiction has more to do with trauma than with the substance. And in my view, this is why Namibia has so many addicted individuals, because the trauma of colonization and apartheid that's never had any trauma work done around it, together with a lack of resources and opportunity that we currently see, as well as a lack of the basics like food and shelter, cause even more trauma, hence the high numbers of violence and addiction. And just lastly, I also want to include that the violence of prohibition and locking people up in cages for the use of a plant is far more harmful and traumatic on the communities than the cannabis plant itself.
Thank you very much, Angela. I think it might be best to skip you, Adam, because then we can get Verona, who's more sort of on the anti-cannabis side, and then you can weigh in on the end. Verona, what are your views?
I'm not really the anti-cannabis, but Jana, I will talk more about, I'm not working for government anymore, but I know that government has a power and has the sovereignty to actually exercise that right, what is legal in the country and what is illegal. And currently cannabis is illegal, and hence also the curiosity of it will also be there. People want to explore. We know in any type of behavior, people want to explore, they want to know, to use. But hence also, tobacco is also a legal drug, and people are also addicted to it. Alcohol is also a legal drug. So the concept of addiction is quite high. We have, like in Namibia, we are in the African region, which have 54 countries, and we are currently 5th in terms of alcohol abuse, and we are 4th in suicides, and we are about 2.2 million people. So it's quite shocking to see how many people are already using substances that is now on a global mentioned by World Health Organization on that matter. So addiction is quite a topic that is coming to the surface, and there are a lot of contributing factors, both on legislation, underage drinking, underage using of tobacco, what is used, and by families, if families more likely want to introduce young people to alcohol, are also more likely to have addiction in that. So you will find that in some families, people, if the parents smoke, it's more likely that children are also smoking or try to go to addictive type of behaviors. But it is a debate currently in the country, and one should be open about it, but also that the state has its regulatory power in terms of that.
Thank you very much, Verona. Adam, what's your view on addiction in particular? You were very keen to discuss this.
Actually, Angela and Verona explained it so perfectly. There's not much more I can say. I suppose I can just reiterate, it's, yes, a large percentage in the 90s has its roots in trauma. But we need to understand trauma as well, because we are a society who thinks and feels that trauma is something significant that has to happen and has this impact immediately, like sexual assault or a car crash or death of a family member. But if we look at generational trauma, if we look at childhood trauma, in the context of society believes that addiction is hereditary, for instance. I don't believe it's hereditary. I believe that if you grow up under circumstances, like Verona said, where there is an addiction or addictive behaviors, and you as a child are busy figuring out the world, your brain, and it's been proven, your brain actually forms physical structure that makes the brain function differently than the person that was not exposed to it. So yes, we need to understand trauma first of all. I mean, you have people who have a substance use disorder whose parents never had any substance use disorder and or even using any substances. So what is that about? So I don't believe it's hereditary. I definitely feel there's a lot of merit in that it's comes from trauma. And we live in a society that is very traumatized worldwide. Yes. We are traumatized not because of stuff that's happening to us, but we are traumatized because we are raised by a generation who was traumatized.
Okay.
And that carries through. That affects our attachments and everything going forward. So yes.
All right, thank you very much. And I think this is probably the one question that everybody who's watching this debate wants to hear. And Angela, we'll start with you. Is cannabis a gateway drug, and why do you say so?
So I think cannabis is not a gateway drug. I think we have to look at the definition of a gateway drug. It's defined as a drug which supposedly leads the user onto more addictive or dangerous drugs. Worldwide, the substances that most of us start using first and foremost are alcohol and tobacco. And this is the evidence points towards that. So I believe alcohol and tobacco are gateway drugs. But even that term, I have a little bit of an issue with that term because, for example, as per evidence-based multi-criteria study done by Professor Dr. David Nutt on substances and their harms, published in The Lancet in 2019, alcohol and tobacco are more dangerous to the user and the community than cannabis, ecstasy, and like a whole plethora of other substances. So even that phrase of, the gateway drug, one drug leading to other drugs, there's many people that never go on, to using drugs or getting addicted to drugs or using harder drugs. I think it's really important to understand that we as humans, throughout all our history, have tried to alter our state of consciousness using plants or substances. And I think that this is part of the exploration of ourselves, you know, and in terms of spirituality or religion, that great question of the meaning of life and why are we here. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. You know, the majority of people, if you really look at the statistics, even though there's high rates of addiction worldwide, because we are, you know, traumatized, there is also, if you look at the statistics, the numbers are not that great of people who go on to be addicted to substances or to use, you know, more hardcore drugs. If you look at the percentages, for example, of people that, you know, try out crack or become addicted to crack, it's actually a really minute percentage. So I think that is something to really bear in mind. I think that whole statement of, like, you know, what is a gateway drug and cannabis is the gateway drug and alcohol, I think that's quite a problematic statement, and that we need to readdress that. And I think trauma is what is the gateway to any kind of drug, really, and to any addiction. That's problematic, because just the using of drugs is like, you know, people like to have their glass of wine after work, and that's not problematic. So okay, that context is problematic. But that's,
thank you. Yes,
Cannabis
Verona, your view. Verona, it's your turn. Yes.
Yes, Jana, that actually started with the early 90s with younger children who started to experiment, and we started to use that word loosely to say it's an entry drug. So, you know, it was, and then everyone was sort of using it all over. But what comes to mind is this, you know, that you never know whether you are predispositioned to actually have a psychotic episode. You don't know how your body chemically, physically, emotionally might react. And we don't know what is in that specific marijuana. So we have seen young people, and I talk very young people, I talk about from the age of 14, 16, early 20s, even at university, who started to use dacha, like just experimenting. And you find them at the ER getting psychotic. So the idea for them was to experiment. It was to have fun. It wasn't for them to have a psychotic episode. So the issue of the matter is, how do I know that I will not have that episode? And how do I know I can use it wisely and moderately? And if you see in terms of the stats, in terms of substance abuse addiction, there are about 6 questions that WHO currently is saying about alcohol abuse and addiction. So, and one of is the idea of getting the moderation of drinking. So my concept to bring it, the moderation of how do you moderate that usage, and you don't know how your body will react.
Okay. Adam, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I honestly can't support the claim or the concept of a gateway drug. I mean, we've spoken about the trauma. So, I mean, if there are many factors that would contribute, that would give you a proclivity to addiction, like Verona also mentioned. So I think cannabis was viewed as the gateway drug because, like Verona said, that was the drug that was available to younger children, you know, and that was what was on the foreground. It wasn't, no one at the age of 13 and 14, my generation, ever spoke about cocaine. It was all, have you tried dacha? Have you tried dacha? Because it was readily available and it wasn't viewed. In actual fact, my opinion was that kids were aware of it and willing to do it because there were talks that it might not be that harmful. You know, we'll never do cocaine. That's too dangerous. So yes, I don't believe in the concept of the gateway drug. I believe in, yes, the entry drug, you know, the first one that you were exposed to. But if you have circumstances and pathology that has formed up to a point where you are introduced to a drug or you expose yourself to drug, then the risk for addiction goes up.
Okay.
It doesn't matter what drug it is. I believe, and I see it in practice a lot, there are addictive thinking and behavior way before the person actually starts using. So you can't blame cannabis, you can't blame cocaine for that. And I'm also speaking from personal experience. I'm a recovering addict myself. And if I look back, if I do the transgression therapy, if I look back at it, the behavior, the soothing behavior that I cultivated to become okay had nothing to do with substance, had nothing to do with cigarettes. Mine, for instance, had to do with food and other behaviors like struggling to be honest and things like that. So if you want to talk gateway drug, I think it's different for everybody. You should talk about gateway behavior possibly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So,
Yeah,
all right.
true.
All right. So, and then the mental health issues. You've touched on that a little bit, Verona. Angela, if we can just start with you, mental health issues or health dangers at this point on the use of cannabis.
Okay, so yeah, I'm gonna, because that's, shall we just merge those two questions?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
there's the,
Yes.
yeah. I mean, I would like to go last on this one, but I'll be happy.
Okay.
I'd like to just hear the response, because often I want to delve into a little bit about the whole schizophrenia and psychosis, but so I'd like to hear what Verona has to say first, if that's okay.
Verona, the floor is yours.
My experience in terms of the mental health facilities, you will always see that a third or a half, 60% of the beds are always occupied by people who are addicted to substances, and therefore has developed either depression or bipolar, having a psychotic episode. That is what is normally happening. And even in the private sector, where I've worked in a private hospital, we have found that 60% of our hospitalizations were due to substance abuse, and not only dacha. It's not only marijuana. It could be crack cocaine. It could be any other types of drugs. So I will not say it's only dacha, but you will find that 100% of them have started with dacha.
Adam, do you want to go next? Because Angela wants to go last. Okay.
Yeah. So in my many years of working outpatient, inpatient, personal experience, I think any substance, depending on your pathology and your physiology, can possibly potentially cause some or other mental impairment or breakdown or disorder, whether it's temporary or permanent. But in my experience in the Western Cape, for instance, the statistics there were quite high, where a lot of adolescents presented with temporary psychosis because of cannabis use. But yes, all substances has its danger, and it's like Verona said earlier on, it all has to do with where is your pathology at that point. How stable is it? Anything. I mean, you can have a psychotic episode from stress, so you can't just blame. You can't just blame or from trauma. You can't just blame the drug for the mental health issues.
Yeah. Okay, Angela, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so here I want to really, this is why legalization is harm reduction, because in all of these instances and all of the data that's available, the cannabis itself never gets tested. It doesn't get tested for what chemicals it's grown with. It doesn't get tested for what it's laced with. And this is what we often see, in underground black markets, that to get it across borders, people are spraying it with all sorts of chemicals to mask the smell. There is no regulation on growing with chemicals. So you essentially have a substance that you're ingesting that you don't know what's in it. So the cause of that very often, can be like, it adds to the danger and the harm of the substance, because essentially cannabis itself, is great, for example, as a therapeutic substance for the psychosis of crack or alcohol or mandrax or speed. It works very well for helping people when they are in a psychosis of a different substance. It's used as a therapeutic tool. And for me, the thing as well is in those statistics that are available, very often people are not inquiring whether that person has been utilizing any over-the-counter pharmaceutical drugs, whether alcohol or cigarettes have been involved. And very often alcohol and cigarettes do not get noted down because they're legal substances. There's also enough evidence that suggests that, people who have schizophrenic episodes or who have psychotic episodes are predispositioned, by there's hereditary predisposition towards that. And also those individuals who are predispositioned use all manner of substances at a much larger, use more substances and more quantities of them. Which very often then bring on these psychotic episodes. So I think, cannabis was great as that, that finger pointing, oh yeah, it's the cannabis that causes psychosis. But actually all these other factors very often do not get taken into account, and I think for anyone who's got in their family psychosis or schizophrenia, any kind of substance, including cannabis, is potentially harmful. And I would not advise that, the same for a developing brain. I wouldn't advise children to be smoking cannabis, unless there's an illness and, they have either epilepsy or cancer, then cannabis is a great medicine for the developing brain. But also I think legalization is where we reduce the harms, because the majority of people, and I work in addiction as well and in trauma, and the majority of people who have these episodes, most of them don't even know where the cannabis comes from that they've smoked, and most of them have been, often these psychotic episodes come when people have been utilizing a whole plethora of substances over a period of time, mixing, from sleeping pills to alcohol to energy drinks, and then all of a sudden, the psychosis happens and the cannabis is the one substance that gets picked out. And in terms of the health issue for the body, cannabis has no real danger to health. All of us in our body have a system that regulates every single function, and that system is the endocannabinoid system, and we have those receptors for cannabis in our brain and in every single organ, and there is absolutely no amount of cannabis that you can consume that will kill you. You might have a really hard time, and you might have psychosis might be a factor, but there is no amount of cannabis that can kill you. And often cannabis is used in the treatment of psychosis of other substances.
And that's exactly, thank you, Angela, which we were getting to for our next question. And I don't know whether I want to start with you, but let me get the question out there. Are there any benefits to the use of cannabis? We have seen positive effects with COVID research. There have been several studies that indicate that there are health benefits. Some say it can be used in a treatment plan for recovering addicts. What is your view? Would you like to start, Angela, or would you like Verona to take the lead?
I can start.
Okay.
I'm like flip-flopping here. Okay, so I'm a cannabinoid practitioner. I work with cannabis as a natural medicine. I've been doing this for 5 years, and I've treated and supported, over 2,000 people with cannabis. Cannabis has a lot of benefits. Like I said, all humans and animals, except for insects, have the endocannabinoid system in their body. So we naturally produce endocannabinoids in our body, and this system keeps us in balance and keeps us in homeostasis. So for me, cannabis is a great natural, safe alternative to pharmaceuticals. So it works like a lock and key system, so the cannabis we put into our body, it locks with the receptors that we have into our body. And so this is why it works so effectively and safe for things like pain, nausea, epilepsy, Parkinson, anxiety, sleep, osteoarthritis, IBS, Crohn's, fibromyalgia. They did a longitudinal study, of like thousands and thousands of people of different age ranges. And the conclusion was that most people are self-medicating with cannabis, anxiety, sleep, pain. So even for mental health issues, like depression, anxiety, OCD, anger, PTSD, it's really beneficial. And for me, the other thing with using cannabis as a natural medicine is the side effects. The side effects of cannabis are minimal, you know, and very safe in comparison to pharmaceuticals, because if you overdose on cannabis, there is no way that you can die from it. You know, you might have a really full-on time and it might not be pleasant, but that's going to wear off. You know, you're not going to have organ failure and your respiratory system is not going to collapse and you're going to stop breathing, unlike with opioids, you know, which we find in the majority of our painkillers, you know, in cough syrups that we give to our children, in so many of the pharmaceutical products that we utilize. The side effects are quite detrimental and dangerous to the user, you know, and one of the side effects is overdose and death, which utilizing cannabis as a medicine, that eliminates that. So for me, you know, it's a really great substance to be used as a first response, you know, also to take pressure off the healthcare system, you know, because sleep, pain, anxiety is very often, you know, things that people go to the doctor for, when we could be treating that with cannabis. And as well with addiction, for recovery, you know, I personally have utilized cannabis with, you know, helping people to recover from alcoholism, you know, crack cocaine, and it works really well. And, you know, the other thing as well is with cannabis, you know, as well as health benefits, I would like to just add that cannabis sativa has, you know, can create, the industrial cannabis, hemp, can create hundreds of different you know, industrial items, from plastic to paper to textiles. So it's a great plant all round to utilize. And even just as consenting adults, for us to be able to utilize it without being locked up, that should be our right, you know, just as people who want to be drinking their glass of wine after work to relax.
Thank you, Angela. Verona, I see you'd like to say something. It's your turn, so you can proceed.
Yeah, Jana, about on a national level, on a macro level, what the country can manage. And currently, Namibia is first in the world in terms of car accidents. And 90% of those car accidents are caused by also alcohol abuse. So if the government will be able to manage currently any form of addiction, if you look at institutional care in Namibia, there are very few where people can actually go for inpatient treatment, outpatient treatment, help. So on a macro level, to allow and to nationalize and legalize marijuana, that will form many, many meetings and thought processes, because it needs to be managed. I do understand if 15% of the population, which might need it due to healthcare, that is something totally different. But to the entire nation to be able to use it in terms of the regulatory framework and in terms of institutionalization of the overseeing of that process in the country to ensure safety and to ensure harm reduction, that is a topic that needs extensive stakeholders, engagement of education, of justice, of health, of different forums, to actually come to a point where they can say, we can control people who are addicted to marijuana. And currently, the state cannot do that.
Yeah. Adam, you specifically wanted to chat about the treatment plan for the recovering addicts. You were quite excited about that. Can you tell us?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at harm reduction, what is harm reduction? It's a set of practical strategies aimed at reducing the negative consequences with drug use. And you have to understand these principles, and it sort of ties on what Angela says as well as what Verona says. So what Verona also said, yes, it can be a wonderful way of doing harm reduction. But then you need someone like Angela, who's a practitioner who understands it, to help such a person. We can't just go out and say, okay, everybody who's experiencing a problem, just go and use marijuana. So yes, there's a place for it. If you look at harm reduction, it's quite prevalent in South Africa, especially in the Western Cape, because what happens there are a large number of opioid and heroin users, and the health system is overloaded. You wait weeks and weeks and weeks to get into treatment to detox. A lot of the state hospitals, including some of Namibia's hospitals, refuses to detox. So now a person is coming to a practitioner like myself, and they're ready for change. And now you have to tell them, everybody has been telling you your whole life you need to change. Now that you're really sorry, there's no help for you. So in terms of reducing the harm of coming off the risky substances like opioids and heroin, for instance, is you can use cannabis to initiate and to maintain the detox process safely. But again, I'm coming back to, it needs to be managed by someone who knows what they're doing, preferably a practitioner, or at least a multidisciplinary team at the end of the day, or a multidisciplinary team that is advised by a cannabinoid practitioner. So there's definitely a place for that. I mean, luckily I know, Angela, you can correct me if you want. Thank goodness for now, touch wood, Namibia doesn't have such a large opioid using community where harm reduction would feature within the next week or month or so. But we need to gear ourselves for when that happens. Our health system is already not coping with normal, everyday general medical problems. You know, the opioids, I heard the other day, there was heroin is starting to feature at the coast. And we are not geared for that at all. So yes, I think we should start talking about harm reduction sooner than later.
Okay, and I see we've lost Verona. I think her battery gave in. Angela, just for the viewers, give us a simplified definition. I'll ask Adam as well now if he can add on to it. Exactly what is harm reduction? We're not all as well versed in these kinds of, but so what is harm reduction? Could you define it?
So I will define it, and I just want to add this point, which I think is really, really important. The people who are using cannabis are already using it. Legalizing cannabis does nothing to those numbers. And looking at countries who have legalized, it actually brings those numbers down, especially in youth use, because now we can regulate. So harm reduction, when we talk about legalization, right now, you know, you buy your cannabis off the street. You don't know what chemicals are used to grow it. You don't know what's laced in it, because the majority of cannabis on the street that's being tested, you know, has got some other substance in it, because it's lucrative for the dealer to lace it, whether it's mandrax or crack or whatever, you know, to make it more addictive, to make it stronger. That's always been the case with prohibition, to get the strongest product, you know, in the smallest amount. And moving cannabis, you know, cross borders, we can see the demand in Namibia. You know, we have tons of cannabis that comes in from South Africa and Angola, you know, that's being like confiscated. There is literally thousands and thousands of kilograms of cannabis in Namibia. It's already being used. You know, legalizing that will reduce the harm, because then what we can do is we can start testing the cannabis. We can have regulation on the fact that when cannabis is grown, it has to be grown organically. You know, it has to be a balanced strain. You know, it's tested for its quality, it's tested for contamination, it's tested for its strength, so people know what they are ingesting. And also there's an age limit and an age restriction on top of that. So already doing that, you're reducing the harm. And by the taxes that you place on cannabis, you can start to actually, you know, train social workers in trauma response, in proper trauma response, because in Namibia, we don't have trauma response, you know, we don't have any kind of care for addiction or trauma, and this is necessary. So the taxes of cannabis can start to initiate this, you know, even open up some more rehab facilities.
Yeah.
And this is what, you know, what harm reduction is.
Adam, is there something you want to add? Verona's coming back. I see she's connecting to audio in a minute, but Adam, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, you know, there's so much about what Angela just said that I agree with. I think it's very antiquated way of thinking that we're going to stop people from using to begin with. I mean, no law, I mean, no amount of jail time, nothing. It's not going to scare people off from using. I think if we look at a substance that has some medical value, then yes, start regulating it, and help people rather than jailing people for it. And I completely agree with that. And I think we live in a society where we want to find fault and blame and hurt and harm instead of reducing harm. And we need to start talking about these things.
Verona,
Yeah.
and your definition then of how you would define harm reduction, just for those watching the video.
In terms of harm reduction, we talk about the regulation of underage, where people, when they are underage, that they are protected by law, but also that there are interventions and programs to help them. And also that there must be an age restriction in terms of, is it allowed whenever it's allowed? And I know it's not allowed in our country. So all the labeling and packaging and warning signs, warning information about the dangers of it, programs that are available, so that there is protection around those who want to use it, and also those who don't want to use it, that there's protection around that.
All right. Okay, so we've come sort of to the end, but I would like to ask each of you to just give me some closing remarks, what you'd like viewers to take away. Angela, we'll start with you.
Okay. Wow, yeah, I mean, I can go on for very long with this. With that, what I would like people to take away from this is, you know, I think for many years there's been a lot of fear mongering and misinformation around cannabis, and I think that needs to be replaced with research, especially at a level of health practitioners and government, because a lot of the people in communities, you know a lot more about cannabis than people at healthcare level and in government. I think it's really important to, when we look at substances and at regulation of substances, that we approach it from, you know, evidence and research. And there is a lot of evidence and research in terms of cannabis. And I think that it's the time now to look at that, rather than, you know, keep on with this fear mongering stigma around cannabis. You know, this plant has a lot of potential, and I'm not saying it's for everybody. You know, I'm not encouraging the whole country to use it. I'm not encouraging children to use it, but for consenting adults who want to use cannabis, whether they are ill or not, you know, that should be a human right. And I think in terms of the fact that the plant has so much beneficial potential, that really needs to be taken into account, and we need to utilize the plant for its benefits. Yeah, you know, for me, legalization is the way forward, because we can reduce the harms of the current system, not just prohibition, but also, you know, like the underground market that doesn't, that has no transparency.
All right.
So education on cannabis, I think, is key.
Thank you, Angela. Verona, what are your thoughts? Takeaway thoughts?
Yeah, mine, Yana, will be more like, I will look at more on a robot light, like the green light. It's an individual decision. But just know when you go and make that decision, you are in your yellow, right? Where you haven't, your smoking or usage has an impact on your community. And then in your red light, when you have some problems and you come and run into some problems, that government has the responsibility to regulate, whether it's the usage, whether it's the prevention, whether it's the treatment, whether it's the regulation of it, that government has a role and a function to play, which does influence communities, and it does influence your individual decision.
Thank you very much. Adam, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think what I would like people to maybe think about, not necessarily take away and understand from the get-go, is Yeah, the focus on the negative focus on cannabis and substance, yeah, there's merit for the negative focus, but I think we need to move away from the idea that using any substance or to be inclined to want to use any substance is a moral issue. We should move away from that. Much like Verona just used the traffic light analogy is I also would like to say to people, you don't wake up one morning and you get up and decide, now I'm going to start using cocaine, right? But if you get to that point where you are either where there's changes in in the behavior of your current substance, the change in the relationship, or whether you are starting to consider and entertain the idea of using something, then stop for a moment and ask yourself, what is happening to me that I want to soothe? What is happening to me that makes me feel uncomfortable? It's, if you look at addiction in general, it is the final symptom of someone not being okay. It is, people who are addicted are not bad people. They are people who have, and if you speak to any of them, they will explain to you how much they have tried over the course of their life to not end up in the position that they are. And that comes back to the harm reduction. This is where cannabis can play a role again in people finding themselves in that spot. But I also agree, don't just take away that cannabis is safe and then start using it. Yes. I'm also not yes. Yes. Yeah. I think when people need to start making informed decisions and educated decisions.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for your time.